For those of you who have joined us for the first time, this webinar series is focused on HR and workplace topics with the lens of culture, DEI, and sustainability. I am Dr. Tiffany Ingram, DEI advisor at Our Office, where we help organizations with proven, effective, and affordable solutions for planning, managing, measuring, and engaging everyone to drive a more inclusive workplace experience for all individuals to belong and be productive. Today, I'm very excited to be joined by Sulaiman Adan, HR leader and board member of More Than a Single Story, Kristen Crockett. She is an intuitive leadership coach, author, facilitator, and speaker at the Crockett Collective, and Emily Citrian, author and CEO and co-founder of Yield. Welcome to you all. Before we get into the meat of this discussion, I want to make sure everyone is familiar with our logistics for today. We are using the webinar, Zoom webinar tool, which many of you are familiar with. As you will know, this webinar will be interactive, so we encourage you to use the chat forum to provide your comments and any other questions you may have. We have one of our amazing colleagues at our office, Anishka Sarif, who will be moderating this conversation in real time, chiming in as needed, and letting us know all the amazing questions you guys are asking. Thanks so much in advance, Anishka. We will answer as many questions as we can at the end of our discussion and afterwards if needed, as long as you provide your email address when you ask your question. Also note that this session is being recorded and will be available after the webinar on our events page at ouroffice.io/event. Last but not least, this webinar is approved for SHRM and HRCI recertification credits, and we will be sharing the activity codes later in our discussion. So I want to take this time now to have our panelists share out and begin our discussion. I'm so excited to have each of you here. And to begin our discussion today, I'm sure our audience would love to get to know you better. So we would love for you to share, each of you share a minute or two introducing yourself, your current role, as well as your background and personal experiences that may have brought you to this moment in life in your career and kind of what connects you to this topic that we're discussing today. Can you go first, Kristen?
Sure. So welcome, everybody. I'm Kristen Crockett. I am an intuitive leadership coach and also a facilitator and author. So what I do is I do work with organizations. I work with individuals for executive coaching, but also really jumpstarting teams, growing people, growing leaders, and developing really dynamic leaders as well. So background in HR, having worked in learning and development in various different HR organizations, as well as in learning and development.
Yes, thank you for sharing. Who else would like to go next on sharing out their bios and kind of the connection to our discussion today?
I can go next. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for attending. I'm really excited to be part of this discussion with some incredible panelists, incredible hosts. So my name is Emily Citrian. I am based in Chicago, Illinois, as you may have been able to gather from my background here is the Sears Tower. I have been in management roles in the tech industry for about the past decade or so. But a couple of years ago, I decided to write a book that really was a handbook specifically for millennials who are first-time people managers. So I saw a real kind of lack in the workplace of having the skills and confidence to succeed. Shameless plug, it is here called Make Me the Boss. But within the book, I do have a chapter specifically on facilitating generational diversity because I felt like a lot of new managers didn't really have the training or expertise to be able to lead across generations. So currently today, I have started my own startup. We're just about 3 months into it. It's called Yield, and we do consulting for payments implementations. So that is a little bit about me.
Thanks so much for sharing. And our final panelist, feel free to just introduce yourself as well and share more about your connection to our discussion today.
Thank you so much and welcome everyone. My name is Sulaiman. He, him pronouns work great for me. Currently, I'm an HR director at a research firm in Minneapolis called Research in Action. I'm also a graduate research fellow and PhD student at the University of Minnesota, where I focus and study on education psychology. Really, it's just the psychology of learning, both in children and schools, but also at the organizational level with adults. But I've spent the last, 6, 7 years as an HR consultant working with companies here in the United States, but also abroad, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Like you have these amazing organizations here, even locally, that are doing great work. But it's in my opinion that HR is really the heart of an organization. And if it's pumping and it's strong, the rest of the organization and company will be strong, and making sure that they are the company, but also HR really leaning into their values.
Most definitely. I'm so excited for our discussion today. And just a little bit of background on our topic today. Each May is, folks, we commemorate Older Americans Month. So this month is encouraging and recognizing the countless contributions that older adults make to our communities, their time, experience, talents, and enriching the lives of those around them. And the 2023 theme is around Aging Unbound, which offers kind of thinking about the opportunities to explore diverse aging experiences and discuss how communities can really combat stereotypes. And that is the purpose of our discussion today. As of 2020, 4 generations are working together in the workplace. We have baby boomers, Gen Xers, Millennials, and Gen Zers. And according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, workers ages 55 and over are the fastest growing group in the labor force. In today's workforce, it is really common to see multiple generations working together. But as the workforce becomes more diverse, multi-generational teams are becoming increasingly common, but we're seeing a lot of challenges and opportunities for organizations to grow in that way. So opening up our discussion for today, I would like to have each of our panelists kind of talk about how has the concept of diversity evolved over the years, and what role has age played in that revolution, and particularly maybe how you see this looking at in the workforce.
I can jump in. I think that for diversity, for me, I've never really been happy with the definition of diversity, right? So for me, it really does include everybody. And it is also, I think when we talk about age, when we talk about generations, it's one of the things that we probably talk about the least, especially as it relates to people getting older in the workplace. And what's that like for people who are being laid off or who are switching careers, that are joining? Like, what does that look like in terms of the ageism that they are experiencing in organizations, as well as the support within organizations as needs change? So I think that for me, diversity is really about the individual, whether it's the individual person, the individual team, that individual organization, but it's a starting point for really understanding what the individual needs are for each individual person.
Most definitely. You also bring up a good point about folks re-entering and still staying in the workforce longer. And AARP reports that as of 2020, 70% of workers ages 50 or over plan to continue working even after they may retire from their current job. So a lot of folks are restarting their career, maybe shifting in some way. So we do see that people who are older are working longer, and that's for, a myriad of reasons. And maybe issues with the economy, and things are getting more expensive. So you may retire and realize you can't afford to really retire. So I would love to hear from the other panelists of how they see diversity evolving as well.
Yeah, I think rightfully so, D&I has focused quite a lot on 2 of the biggest ones, which are race and gender. Very important that we're very conscientious of that and bringing diverse perspectives and different backgrounds into the workforce in a really cooperative way. Age is, I think, similar to Kristen. I've noticed not as much attention given to this. And so I'm glad that we're really intentionally focusing on it for all the reasons that the other panelists have stated, but also because I think there's a lot of intersectionality as well. In particular, age discrimination may affect women or people of color more that have had just a different life experience. If there's been, kind of a later in life going to college or taking a few years off to support, a family member or raising children or dealing with, some other kind of life circumstance. I think age discrimination and in fact, encouraging age diversity has a lot of positive effects of intersectionality on other categories of diversity. So I'm glad that it's kind of being carved out separately. I don't think there's enough conversation about it, but I think that's starting to evolve a bit.
No, as both of y'all are speaking, it reminded me of, so I come with a background in actually creating interview questions and for hiring processes across industry. And when I would come in and do an equity audit, one of the first things that I would see is how are you as a hiring manager, or how are you as an organization, maybe inadvertently or unintentionally, doing some age discrimination against folks who maybe are older, just because you may assume that they may not be able to do what's laid out in the job. And sometimes we see it in the reverse, right? Like, oh, you need 15 years of an experience for a specific job when it's only asking for a bachelor's degree, a very entry, lower level job. But it's also the reverse is also true. I know I look incredibly young, but I do remember when I first started out, coming in as a program manager or at an organization, we were seeing, hey, even though technology has been in the workplace for several years, there was still and still is a steep learning curve. And you would see people helping our older folk in getting more acclimated to tech. But it seems like that's where the focus only is, right? When it comes to diversity in the workplace, I've seen it where we're focusing more on concepts and not so much moving into actually practicing them. And then creating metrics for us organizations, see like how are we living up to the goals that we set when it comes to those D&I goals, specifically when it comes to age, because like you said, only there is a lot of intersection within that.
Most definitely. And no, go ahead, Kristen, because we have an excellent question in the chat, but I would love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, so I think that the other thing that we do need to talk about too is caregiving, right? So that's a huge thing too that has become even bigger as we've gone through COVID. But you definitely have people who are taking care of their parents, who are taking care of grandparents, who might have different generations within the household, and how that impacts people who still are working. But also I'm going to throw in there things like menopause, right? So Drew Barrymore, we're talking about it much more now because of Oprah, because of Drew Barrymore having a hot flash during a session. But things like that, like accommodating, hormonal changes for people that are in the workplace, that is definitely becoming a much bigger subject, especially over in Europe, where now they have, situations where you can have a menopause-friendly accreditation, right, for your workplace. So different things like that. I think that the topics really need to get deeper and broader, and it's important for us to start talking about more things that are impacting different generations.
100%. I think you bring up a great point of like, what can workplaces do to accommodate and support folks? And it could be something that supports someone of all ages. When you have those supports in place and accommodations, it could be beneficial to all the generations in the workforce. We do have a question around what your thoughts may be around multi-generational. Do we think that multi-generational workforce is affecting how we apply to jobs or the kinds of jobs that different generations are attracted to?
I definitely think there is. Yeah, I think it's a human tendency to feel more comfortable with people that are similar to us. I think that's just, we all kind of experience that, but it's not always what's going to help us grow. And I think having multi-generational workforces and really a sense of community is one thing that I fear we're losing a bit, with the really kind of segregation of like, these are the young hip tech companies and these are the kind of old stodgy blue chip companies. And I think in particular, young people who are really coming into the workforce, or somebody even mid-career who's coming into the workforce or making a pivot, would benefit tremendously from being in an environment where there's people of all different levels of experience that can teach them, or even benefit from reverse mentoring. Hey, if you're coming into this with fresh eyes, there's a lot you can teach folks that have been in this space for a decade or more. And so I definitely think it is. I think it's something we have to kind of intentionally work through. But it's something I'm a little bit cautious and sad about, as it seems our workplace culture has segregated a bit more since COVID and the kind of work from home trends.
Any other panelists' thoughts on the question around multi-generational workforce affecting how we apply jobs or the kind of jobs? I know job descriptions is something people look at, like, who are you really trying to recruit here with some of the language and the words that folks are using? Is it something that is inclusive where any person of any age would say, oh, I can feel like I belong in an organization? Our organization always talks about belonging and making sure employees belong and feel connected. Some older persons may not feel like I'm connected to this young hipster kind of environment, and it almost looks like excluding folks in some way.
Yeah, so I think I want to talk about the tenure. That was the second part of that question in the chat as well. Like, now it is much more common. I knew a secretary who had worked in one job from the age of 18 through her 60s, right? So now people are shifting, every year or every 2 years, every 3 years, that type of thing. So it is changing our workplaces as well. It definitely is changing things. And I think that does impact people who have been there for a really long time. But we also have to look at the reverse. Like, it's an incredible thing to be able to, just like, Emily was talking about reverse mentoring. It's an incredible thing to be able to look for people who have seen different executive directors or different presidents, go through. Maybe they've been through 3 or 4 of them, so they know what we've tried, what we haven't tried. They understand, they have connections, they understand different departments, how they work. So it's really looking towards like the beauty in longevity, but also the beauty in working in 1 to 2 years as well, where you can have people with fresh eyes coming in to look at things that other people have been ignoring. So I think it's looking at the pros, looking at the benefits and the beauty in both of those things is going to help us as well.
I agree 100%. I'm for what both of y'all said. Something that comes to mind is something I said before. It's really that hey, like, these are the ideas that we have, things that we want to do, but how, when push comes to shove, how are we actually practicing them? And we see it a lot of times, most notably in the philanthropy space, right? You have folks there who come from a certain demographic, intersections, right? To a certain demographic, certain age group. And you have younger folk who are trying to come in. It's like it's kind of like you need a door to get into the door, to get into the door, to get into that space. And the reverse is also true. Now that you're also part, and I'm working from home, my dad might be in the background screaming. It reverse is also true. Now that we're seeing more startups coming up, especially in the city that I'm in, you're seeing more and more folks, especially hit with the pandemic, coming into workplaces who maybe, or if we even take away from white collar, when we're talking about even like retail spaces, you're seeing more and more older folk coming in and working there. And me coming in as a DI practitioner and doing, workshops and trainings. And that's one of the things that I would come and talk about, and say like, hey, like, how are we actually practicing DE&I, and how are we being inclusive and accessible to folks across generational lines? Yeah. And I think it also begins really in the hiring process, like you mentioned, Dr. Ingram. How are we creating the language in the actual description, and how is the actual hiring process really grounded in equity, inclusion, in accessibility? If we're saying that this is what we want to practice, how is it actually showing up in the workplace?
Most definitely. We're having amazing questions coming in. So folks, continue to put your questions in the chat as we go through our discussion. I know I want to look at And Kristen, I think you touched on this a little bit of like understanding the unique challenges that folks may be facing. But do we see like unique challenges that each generation is facing when it comes to diversity and inclusion? And then what can we do, workplaces, managers, HR professionals, how can we work together to overcome them? Are there unique challenges for every single generation? Are they similar? How are they different? I would love to hear your our panelists' thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think that the reality is that anything that has been said about a generation has been said about a previous generation. It is really, it's like when we think about baby boomers, what was said about them, right? It's current things that are being said about, the current generation. I think that really what it comes down to is it's important for us to look at the fact that it's a starting point to talk about the different generations, right? But it doesn't mean that somebody who is a baby boomer is not incredible with technology. It doesn't mean that somebody who, is, Generation Z loves social media. There are plenty of people who are not even on social media, right? So I think it's also understanding that just like when we talk about race or gender or culture, that nothing is a monolith. We are not a monolith, right? So it's like we have to look a little bit deeper and really see like what are we just talking about in terms of, oh, well, these people are like this, or they don't have this particular work ethic, versus really getting to the individuals and looking at what's the language that we're just repeating over and over again.
Most definitely, because I think that language is harming us and continuing to have that. Millennials are known as like the trophy kids, or like we got a trophy for everything, and entitled generation. But me showing up as a Black woman who's also a millennial, my experience looks very different. There was no life of entitlement for me. So I think those intersections are important, but often that millennial generation stereotype that I get is like, oh, she doesn't know any better. She doesn't know, or she didn't work hard to get to where I am today in my career. So I think there are some stereotypes that can be harmful and really disconnect the employee from their workspaces and their colleagues as well. Any other thoughts around that unique challenges and that each generation may face, and really how we can overcome them?
Yeah, I think that the human brain also has a tendency to make assumptions that others are like them, in addition to wanting to be around people that are like them. We all fall into this trap. And so as somebody in their mid-30s, you may assume that other people in their mid-30s are thinking about having children and are dealing with aging parents, and the thing they care about most in life is buying a house. That's very important to unpack. It's very important to not project those assumptions about where somebody might be into how you manage or how you lead. And so my book, I don't have kind of the HR training that I think some of our other panelists have, but I know as a people manager, one of the most important things that you can do is to take yourself and your perspective and what you want for your own life at certain stages out of the conversation. And I've been in spaces where, a promotion discussion was under consideration, or we're evaluating a candidate, and people have said things like, well, they've only been out of college 4 years. When I was 4 years out of college, I wasn't ready for that job. Or, this person spent about a decade in between careers. I don't know if they're, and those things are age discrimination. It absolutely is. And so what it really starts with is taking what you expect to be true or have experienced in your life and not projecting that out. That said, I also do think that there are some things that are somewhat common across generations, particularly in what parts of the business cycle they've experienced. So Generation X, for example, probably remembers a lot about the first wave of tech and what was the .com, the first wave of the .com era, and what was it like when Amazon and Google and those companies were kind of starting out. And so that's one example where I think a particular generation may really have a lot to offer because they lived it. They can teach us, well, how can that apply to what's happening with AI right now, or what's going on with Facebook? So I think it's a little bit of not projecting or having that expectation, but also understanding that a generation may have a really unique perspective that could really enhance the business conversation about how that relates to the current times.
I love that, and I'll try to be brief because I just saw like a huge question come in. I just wanted to make 2 points. One, in the area of psychology that I studied, there's a point that was or an area that was taken as fact that was, hey, you need 10,000 hours of practice in a certain space or a certain field in order for you to become an expert. However, with the advent of technology and the expanded access of it that we have now, that's much lower. Now you're seeing folks who, especially now with AI, you can, spend a good 3 months, half a year, on something and, be really, really good at it, right? You don't need several years in something in order to become an expert in anything. In some area, I think in medicine, right? You want your doctor to go to medical school for 4 years, right? And to get that residency and all that. But I just find that really interesting that even though like the science has come out dispelling otherwise, that we're still holding on to collectively as a workforce, still holding on to these biases that we have. And the other thing is that the organization I'm a board member of, More Than a Single Story, we had a similar conversation like this, but it was across generational lines. So we had folks who were of the quote unquote baby boomer generation. We have Gen Xers, Millennials, and then Gen Zers who were just starting to get into the workforce. And then having them talk about the biases or the thoughts that they had against each other, and then things that they have to go through, um, you know, as like representatives of their groups while they're in the workforce. I just found that a little interesting.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Suleiman. I also want to point out Martin Luther King was 26 years old during the bus boycott, right? Like a lot of these civil rights leaders, they were in their 20s. And so it took a tremendous effort to put all of that together. And it gives us perspective when we look at what we think someone in their 20s is capable of, right? So I definitely also want to point to Sonia's, Sonia or Sonia, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, so sorry if I pronounce it wrong, but your question in the chat box, I do want to point out a really great example of a general manager that I knew at a media company, and she was responsible for sales. And so what ultimately used to happen is that individuals would go after accounts, just individuals. Well, what they did is they actually created trios. They created different pods from different generations and had people collectively sharing information and going after accounts together. And then they could place people in their zone of genius. If somebody felt comfortable, because actually an example for them, they had somebody who was, in their 50s who was the best at social media. So they, he was in his zone of genius while other people had other different, they brought different contributions to that group, right? And so it's really looking at what you can bring across generations, putting people together. And then also, they also had the CEO there also talked about, he did something weekly where he had reverse mentoring, where it's like, what can you all teach me? So I think that was a really important thing where he created discussions around that so that people are really like, both of those things are examples of people talking, communicating, bringing personal stories and working together to bring their talents together.
Yeah, I think, and you kind of picked out from our audience question around like, how does this look in organizations? How do you do a good job of leveraging that age diversity? And what can people do to really make sure everyone, like Kristen is saying, is in your zone of genius, right? We're working together. Everybody has some things that they could be experts in, but how do we have examples of organizations of companies who are doing this well, or examples of how this can look in a workplace for someone where they can leverage that diversity?
I had an organization that I had come in as a consultant with, um, who on their application had a checkbox to see what generation you were a part of. And I was perplexed. I was like, okay, I'll go ahead and click the millennial box. And when I got into the interview, I was too scared to bring it up in the first interview. But the second interview, I was like, okay, things maybe we're comfortable with each other now. But I was like, why is this? They were like, oh, like we're not they were like, did you read what was like right above it? And I was like, listen, I go through so many applications. I'm just clicking. But they pulled it up and it said that, we ask this question so that we are like we aim to have, a distribution of multiple perspectives in life and lived experiences in our workplace. I was like, oh, that's amazing. And then like when I started working there, I saw and I saw it. I had folks who were from the baby boomer generation. I saw folks who were Gen X and millennials and Gen Z all working together. And it wasn't like there was more one or the other. That's not what they were looking for. It's just that you saw them and it was like on purpose. So I just wanted to point that out as an example of an organization. Again, this was a younger organization, meaning that it is a startup, so that like then that comes with more innovative ideas. But that organization then goes on to impart this practice of hiring with the clients that they have, and some of it has been landing, but some of it does take some time um, to kind of have it digest for some organizations. But I thought that was really neat.
Yeah, I would wonder about the legality of that.
Yeah,
I know
it's
startups
a
sometimes
slippery
use
slope.
different things, but we have to also look at whether or not something is legal to ask about people's age. Depending on. So I want people to check into that.
Most definitely. I feel like the concept of the reverse mentoring is a way that people can really connect different generations or folks who just have maybe more work experience than others. But what are some other ways that organizations can really connect those boxes? I feel like I've worked in government for the bulk of my career. I have often been the youngest person on my team, and I've had to kind of build those relationships myself with the veteran employees. It really was no assistance in connecting the dots. I think I spent a lot of time kind of learning people and kind of how they work to be able to effectively connect with them and communicate with them while I was on a team with some people who were older than my mother and me. So they had grandkids that were my age, some of them. I feel like it was a missing link on like what or like how people could connect folks. I'm kind of good with connecting with people, so it's okay. But I do think some of my coworkers was like, no, it's a hard time connecting with somebody who's been here for 40 years. And it was a negative kind of or kind of experience or bias against the person because they automatically assume that they didn't want to learn anything new. But what can workplaces do, or do we know of some examples or some, if we haven't seen it in practice, what they could be doing to really truly connect those dots within the organization across generations in terms of their employees?
Yeah, so selfishly, and I realize, I come from the perspective of the millennial generation, and I wrote my book specifically for the millennial generation. But I think one of the most important things that organizations can do for diversity in all its forms is really invest in fantastic people managers. I have seen a lot of organizations have kind of policies and D&I officers and big investments in all this kind of programming. But at the end of the day, the person that is hiring, firing, promoting, coaching, and really driving culture on the front lines isn't kind of empowered and trained and coached to be a fantastic leader across generations. A lot of those programs don't deliver the kind of ROI that I think we would all hope for. And it's interesting that when I was doing research for my book, the average age of a first-time people manager is 30, which nowadays that's going to be like a little bit younger millennial, maybe like the oldest cohort of Gen Z. And categorically, one of the number one things that people said they were afraid of going into these roles was managing somebody that was older. And so I think people managers are really hungry for this kind of training and really see the value in it. And I think organizations just making that investment in coaching the communication skills, the inclusion skills, and the culture setting skills of the people that are hiring and bringing people into the front lines is going to be one of the most enduring investments.
Yes, I can give a few specifics. So I think one thing that I implemented was, it was called Meet Your Neighbors. And once a month, we would have people, anybody could join in the organization, would come on, and then I would facilitate a little bit of speed networking, just asking the questions, not like people can just show up. And it's just me asking questions and, people getting to know each other, even for saying like, tell me about something phenomenal that's going on in your department right now, right? So a lot of this is about creating interpersonal connections with people across departments and across generations, right? So that's one way of doing it. Something that's virtual, especially if you have a hybrid situation going on right now. If everybody is in person, maybe it is an in-person thing. So I think that's important to maybe have 5 questions. And this is something that we did for 45 minutes, right? So people could jump on, they could meet different people. And each time we had different questions and you were meeting different people. And then we started encouraging people to connect with like little coffee or tea chats, right? So 15 minutes. So that's something that you can help facilitate. I think also buddies for onboarding, like actually pairing somebody with someone from, across generations, right? So someone who's been there for a long time, who understands people. And that's the biggest thing. When you show up and you're new to an organization, you are afraid of a lot because you went from knowing everything to like, now you're like learning everything all over again, right? And so having them partner with someone who could give them different background information, I think is a great idea. And maybe it's 2 buddies, right? Like maybe it's different perspectives. And then I also think like in engaging people who've been at an organization for a longer time, what are some things that would be helpful for onboarding, right? So different ideas that are coming from different generations. The more you ask, the better perspectives you're actually going to receive. And then the last one I'll say is technology. If you are in the workplace, like even doing, like Discovery did this really well back in the day, where it was, they had different Microsoft courses that you could take. So it could be basics of Excel, basics of Teams or Word, but also accelerated classes as well. So this is a way where if you are afraid to ask for help, you don't even need to. You can just sign up for a class and, talking about excelling in technology. I think that's really important. It's something that we don't necessarily, a lot of organizations don't really put a lot of thought or dollars behind.
Yeah, that's a good. I feel like I need the Excel class as well now. Even as a millennial, like Excel is literally it's often the hardest thing ever when it's time to actually get something done on it if you don't use it often. One big question that I think kind of came up out of all of your discussion is around communication. I feel like each one of you said something about communication, and one of our persons that are tuning in wanted to know what kind of tensions or conflicts do you see, do you think evolve from intergenerational workforce, especially the hip young Gen Z advancing their ideas, and folks saying they have that lack of experience, but really appearing passionate and sometimes aggressive in doing so. And then the experienced Gen X or baby boomer, perhaps providing that wisdom of their experience, but feeling threatened in doing so. Just really thinking about the communication gap that sometimes exists on how people perceive different generations and how they communicate. Any thoughts on that? What tensions are there and maybe possible ways to resolve it or work through them?
Yeah, it's a big one. I know that one of the stereotypes of millennials is we don't particularly like to pick up the phone and call people. We're more comfortable in kind of DMing. We also use kind of like memes and internet references to communicate. And we do have a tendency, I think, to bring that into the workplace, sometimes at the risk of alienating other generations who may not have those references. Or I think now some Gen Z is feeling a little cringe about the way that millennials communicate. So I think one is just to be aware of it. You know, if you're not totally comfortable picking up the phone because of whatever reason, kind of being able to meet halfway. If you have team members that, you know, seem to prefer one method of communication or the other, again, you don't have to completely kind of come over to that side, but just be thoughtful about certain people. Just they appreciate a phone call more than a Slack message, and so kind of be willing to be a bit flexible there. But I also don't think you have to beat yourself up about it. If there are team members that you relate to more because you have similar, you know, cultural touch points, similar TV shows, or just cultural references, it's fine to talk about those in the workplace. Just be conscious that they don't get special access to you or special, you know, kind of privilege in the workplace as a result of having that personal connection versus somebody that may not. So I think it's kind of, you know, being thoughtful about it, and being able to separate, you know, when you may have something in common with somebody, and you can kind of, you know, connect over that, but realizing that that doesn't necessarily translate into them getting, you know, kind of a special access.
Yeah, the one thing I would add to that, and what reminded me on, is like as DNI practitioners here in the space, is something that you all may already know, is what we don't want to do is assume shared meaning, but what we do want to do is create a shared understanding. As humans, it's normal that conflict happens. It's a normal, natural human experience. But what we can do is to make plans on how to manage it. And I say manage it because you can't really resolve it, but there's going to be some like emotional breadcrumbs left over in that space. But understanding and learning what each other's communication styles are is kind of like the first step there, right? I'm someone who prefers me being told something directly, right? Don't beat around the bush. Don't tell me a story, right? Don't give me a, what do they call it now, a feedback sandwich. Like just tell me straight on. Others may prefer something different, right? But coming in a space together, holding space together, and getting to the bottom of that may help in not resolving tensions, but like kind of explaining why they're there.
Yeah, and I see RC, I love this as well. So just talking about the communication for the specific acronyms. I see that, you know, also in onboarding, like when people are coming into a new organization and not understanding, like, you know, the acronyms that people are using all of the time. So I think that even you know, this would be an interesting creative activity to say, like, well, how can we, do we have like a word of the month, or do we have a word of the week, right? That just explains it, right? So that's something fun that can go out. But I think the other thing that came up for me is Slack. So I've always been a person who is great with technology. However, what happens is I see a difference. There's two things. One of them is that I see a butting of the heads a little bit in terms of wanting things, different generations wanting things to happen today and now without the red tape, and others where it takes, you know, 6 weeks to do something, 6 months to do something that maybe at another organization it took them 1 week, right, to accomplish. So I think that the red tape and the steps, I do see that as clashing amongst generations, and sometimes not even explaining the why, like, what is this about? And so I think that some of this, the behind the scenes of really understanding how the organization operates and how to do things can be kind of lost, because a big thing for, you know, Chase, that bank was talking about the fact that kids, a lot of people growing up now, right, did not actually have house phones. So even not understanding how to take messages at work, right? And then taking that next step of, sometimes they'll take the messages, but not actually giving it to that person, because there's no training on that. There's no training on that. There's no way to utilize that. Even dress codes can be a little bit different. But going back to technology, when we're dealing with Slack versus email versus Teams versus, you know, Zoom chat, like all of these different ways that organizations are communicating can sometimes be a little bit overwhelming for individuals, but also for generations, right? So, you know, what if someone chooses not to be on Slack, right, because they just want to be on email? then what's the culture that they're losing out on when everybody else is on Slack? So I think these are things that we need to think through even deeper to understand, like, is Slack for everything, for example, right? And email is changing. A lot of people, like especially students in the college access world, students are not like, they're not even responding to their email. So going into the workplace, they're not even really utilizing email because they're used to DMing and text and things like that. So these are all things that we need to look at as an organization, because that is changing, right? And email may go a different way.
Yeah, and I think even with email is so touchy too, because it's the way that the tone. So a lot of my coworkers have had issues with, oh, kind of pulled aside for your tone for that, because as Suleiman said, like, I want direct feedback. I have some people who, like, if you send them a direct message, they're upset about that. They see that as rude via email. So I think it really is about bringing back to Emily, how does the people manager really display that example of excellence of how that team should work, and what do we use Slack for? If this is like a one answer kind of question, or what is an email? When do you need to send an email of things that need to maybe be documented in a more formal way? And then when do you kind of use the phone and kind of get up and make that phone call to people? And trying to figure out those modes of communication within their team and create that standard of excellence there. Because I know some people who are like, I closed Microsoft Teams. That tab not even open on my computer. You messaged me. It's like, people have been looking for you. But in many ways, folks are like, if you're looking for me, you should call me. Even living in this hybrid or in remote way, it's like, I have a phone number at the bottom of my signature. You can call me. So some folks do look for that kind of phone call in terms of having that more intimate communication. But I think for me in my workspace and my colleagues I used to work with, you have to take time to learn your team and see kind of everyone's kind of learning style as well, and how they like to be communicated with. So there are some people who are like, Slack me for everything. And some people you do need to call because that is their particular communication style. So learning your team is really, really important. We have so many questions popping up in the chat. I do see Cinnamon saying, as we talked about startups, just because they're a younger startup, what does that mean? Really mean they have more innovative ideas, understanding that innovation is not attached to an age. So thank you for that point, Cinnamon, as well. We also talked about the modes of communication. I think a lot of people are using different slang terms of lit and, ghosting. This person ghosted me, like maybe somebody emailed you, they didn't respond, and they ghosted me, understanding that not everybody is using that particular language in the workplace, and not everybody knows exactly the definition of what that means. We have another question around inclusive communication, and let me read it out for the group. And inclusive communications in terms of the speaker to accommodate the listener and disregard the way in which the speaker can most effectively communicate, or is it more inclusive to allow the speaker to communicate in their own style and have the listener try their best to understand? Any thoughts on that in terms of communication? Should we allow people to communicate in the style that works best for them, or should we be tailoring it to the person we're delivering that message to?
I mean, I think it really all depends on the situation and the topic. What I definitely teach is individualization, like getting to know on your team who prefers what, even around feedback. Like, I like direct feedback, but that doesn't mean that everybody else on my team likes direct feedback. So like understanding the individual preferences on your team. Sometimes depending on how large your organization is, like if this is a small organization and you've got 20 people, you can definitely do some individualization. But if it's thousands of people or 20,000 people in different countries and things like that, it makes it a little bit more difficult, right? So it depends on the actual facts of the situation.
I completely agree. I think the purpose of what is being communicated matters a lot. In general, I tend to take, I think it's responsible and reasonable for both parties to kind of meet in the middle. I think ultimately, the kind of burden is on the communicator versus the communicatee. But to your point, Kristen, if we're communicating that, there's been a workplace infraction or you did not meet expectations or there's something very serious, that needs to take a different tone, different approach, to really ensure that that meaning is understood, and that if there are legal implications as to who and where and how it was communicated, that the person communicating is aware of that and is ultimately responsible for it. But if it's communicating about how we plan to deliver this project, or if you're communicating to teach where somebody's learning style really matters a lot, I think there could be a little bit more nuance and more creativity and really intentional inclusion, to make sure that folks are engaged.
Any additional thoughts on that communication?
No, I think I agree with it, with especially with what you were saying, Kristen. Like if I were to speak to everyone how I prefer to be speaking, that wouldn't be fair, right? Nor would it be equitable, right? You approach people and you talk to people the way that they want to be talked to, right? So if I know that, John doesn't like it when I start using lingo or using internet or Twitter references, right? Like I do to the other 7 people on my team, I'm not going to do that with him, right? Um, yeah, it's like for both of you, for Emily and for Kristen, like on that people basis, like how do we engage with and talk to and learn about the people that we actually work with beyond the hat that we wear at work, but who are they as people?
Yeah, and I will say another thing that just popped up for me, Tiffany, is talking about what is professional, like professionalism, and that definition completely changing with generations, right? So now it's, it used to be 20 years ago, seeing somebody with a suit and tennis shoes, that's just like at a wedding, that was a no-go, right? But now it's like you don't really see people without tennis shoes with suits, right? So professionalism has definitely changed in what we define as like talking appropriately, inappropriately. I'm going to use those terms in quotes, right? Because that has definitely shifted amongst generations as well. So I definitely see a difference in the workplace dealing with what is deemed professional and what's not. It's really based on the culture of that particular organization, right?
100%, because I feel like I even got in trouble at work after having a discussion with the school leader, and I'm like, we need to get the team together, and I was like, it's time to get the team in formation. I'm a Beyonce girl. That is my reference, and that often may come across in my communication, in my lingo, and feedback provided to my manager was like, oh, it just seemed Tiffany was a bit unpolished. It was unprofessional. Even that was an internal meeting. It wasn't like a client, like a parent was in the room or an attorney or anything. It was an internal team meeting. And my reference of that, people were upset about it. So I do think that it comes into play of what do you think is appropriate in what setting, and how do we ensure that the overall message doesn't get lost because of the slang that we're using and how we're communicating a message that we may be missing out on that main point.
Yeah,
So
and even communication as it relates to being comfortable talking to a CEO versus like, certain organizations years ago, it was like you never saw the CEO, whereas now it's like certain organizations, what's wrong with someone coming in who's a new employee having a conversation with the CEO? I think even that, like it really changes and shifts within generations as well as what conversations are appropriate to have with whom, and which levels, because now I'm seeing more of like the levels instead of hierarchy, which was the silent generation. It's kind of leveling out a little bit. So that's also another subject that comes up.
yeah, chain of command, that was a big thing. Like, as me, little program manager or program analyst, shouldn't be talking to somebody who is the director, senior director of a unit or department. And I think one of the things somebody pointed out here, one of our guests talking about do you feel like you're sacrificing a part of who you are as a speaker if you need to, can you ever really truly understand the unique complex and web of understanding and experiences if you have to communicate in the style of the listener? We talk so much about authenticity and DEI and showing up as our authentic selves, but are we sacrificing part of who we are if we have to tailor our language and how we speak to folks or how we interact with others on our teams?
So I have thoughts, but I'm going to let Emily or Suleiman, do you all want to jump in on that?
Go ahead. Yeah.
So I think that authenticity, there's okay, you can be authentic with how you are communicating, right? But there's also understanding how it is best received from the other person, right? And timing is a part of that as well, right? So I may want to say something, but just because I've come and I'm like very blunt about it and direct, it doesn't mean that it's going to be received very well, right? So what's the timing? Am I trying to tell you this like 5 minutes before you pack up and go home? Am I trying to tell you when you haven't had your coffee first? So I think timing is important, but it's also like, you know, I can definitely say, yeah, this is just who I am. But at some point, is that an excuse for not understanding that not everybody is going to be as receptive if you say it in a certain way, in a certain manner, right? I might know that you are more receptive for one employee to say, if I sandwich things together, right? A compliment, this is what you need, this is what I want you to shift. And then there's a compliment at the end, whereas somebody else may really hate that model. So I think that when you look at individualization, it is really just about how can you be embraced? How can your communication be received in a better way? And without sacrificing the message and who you are. I think you can do it still without sacrificing your authenticity.
Thing that's coming to mind for me, based on what you're saying, Kristen and Suleiman, you've said a couple things about this too, but I think we've largely been sort of categorizing organizations talking more to frontline employees, but I think a lot of these same things can be said for communicating up or managing up, and sometimes, you know, being mindful of the audience and where they're at and the timing of what may be going on for them, but also showing up as ourselves and being able to have really effective conversations that are so important to managing our own careers within workplaces who may not always be mindful of all of these topics. So I think it kind of goes both ways, and it's useful from both vantage points.
Most definitely. I think as we close out our discussion, I really want Suleiman to kind of share with us maybe what's his thoughts around ensuring all generations that are represented and all generations are represented in DEI initiatives. I think we talked a little bit about, you know, DEI doing all this work and it's supposed to be for the greater good of all employees. But what are some ways that organizations can ensure that everyone has a voice in an organization, regardless of their age, and making sure that our DEI efforts really focus on including all age ranges of folks as well?
Oh, this is a great question. I just wrapped up um strategic planning, like a 6 month session contract that I was working with a client of mine out in Dallas. Um and that's a part of that question is something that came up for them. And for them, they were saying, you know what, like when someone comes in and does and wants us to be more inclusive, and inclusive meaning in this sense, meaning that we want to be able to hear all the voices of change at our organization, and then also be able to, you know, hear it and then implement it, right? Um, it's more so, and that and all the other, when it comes to equity, when it comes to accessibility, when it comes to professionalism in the workplace, and how that's engrossed in white supremacy and all of that stuff, right? It's often, hey, board here, hey, executive leadership team, here's what we want you to do for your team. Like we want to disseminate it into the rest of the organization, right? Or we would come in and do a training or a series of workshops for the organization as a whole. However, for this organization and the practice that I do would be, first and foremost, we're going to work with you, senior leadership. We're going to work with you, execs. We're going to work with you, C-suite folks, because if you all are, absorbing the information and learning to practice it, the folks lower as we move across the organizational ladder are going to see that, like, hey, like, our folks above the organizational ladder are actually practicing it, right? So even if it comes to the language that we use in our actual policies, right, seeing if they're outdated in the HR world, we know that a lot of how we structure our HR handbooks, our employee handbooks, our policies, and all that neat stuff are templates, right? And then it's our job to kind of make it more personalized and unique to the organization that we work for or to work with. So even coming at it from that angle, right? How are we approaching? Is any language that we're using ages, right? Is any language that we're using or angles that we're coming at discriminatory in any way, right? How is it inclusive? And I really do like the example of that Kristen gave, like putting folks into pods and having folks come with like unique experiences. We know that the freshers' eyes are the ones that come with the most. The newest folks always are the ones that come with the freshest eyes, as compared to all the other folks who have been here for, would it be a year, 5, 10, 15, however many years they've been there. But it's really being conscious of it first and foremost, acknowledging that, one, is there a problem within this organization when it comes to the not only the types of folks that work there, meaning sorry, are we having are we more likely to hire folks who come with X more years of experience in this role? Do we really need X number of years of experience in that role? Right? How can we kind of shift our hiring practices to be more inclusive? It's because those folks come with more lived experiences. I could go on, but I also want to be respectful of time.
I know we can go on, and I am so sorry. We are out of time. We've had an amazing discussion. I encourage everyone to connect with our panelists. Their LinkedIn, we've already connected with them on LinkedIn, so their links are there. Even our events page, you'll be able to connect with their LinkedIn and chat with them to further this discussion. Our recertification credits are here on the screen now, so thank you so much for joining this discussion. We look forward to seeing you all next month. Thank you so much for our panelists for sharing their great insight on our discussion today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.
Thanks,
everybody.